Good afternoon, and thank you for coming back from the actual food, and I promise you we will provide you some food for thought in this third panel. My name is Petra. I'm from the University of Ljubljana, and I'll be moderating this panel, which brings together distinguished scholars. And in order to save some time, I will not introduce each and everyone individually. I think we've studied the biographies. But what is important is that they all have to add something that was discussed in the previous two panels, together with the distinguished professor, Jim Soraka, which will in the end provide us with some comments. And as I've learned, all the panelists as well as the discussant will wrap up this third session based on what was discussed before in the morning and what will be said in the course of this third panel, which is titled Memory and Insecurity, in being put in brackets, so security and insecurity in the former Yugoslavia. And with no further ado, I suggest we start in the order that is written in the program. So with the paper presented by Lea David, titled Mediating International and Domestic Demands, State-Sponsored Memory Projects in Serbia. Lea, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to start by thanking to Philip. I think it takes really a sense of edginess to understand that memory politics is one of the most relevant topics now, and bringing it closer to international politics. I think it is really great, and I'm really proud to be in Belgrade at this moment, and we can say that Serbia is leading in something. If there is something, this is it.
It's not only me, it's a group of people.
It's a group of people. Philip and co. Okay, co group of people. I'll try not to make you fall asleep during my presentation. I'll try also to be very concise, which I try mostly, but I don't succeed often. I want to a bit reorganize my presentation because I want to really pick up on some other ideas we had in those last two panels. But the main concept I want to present you here is actually that I think that the process of construction of collective memory in Serbia after the wars of the 90s actually provides a great example how post-conflict states actually deal with conflicting or opposing demands at the international level and on the local level. What are those demands? First of all, we can see on international level, and this is something also to pick up about the notion of small states or weak states. Post-conflict states has to face transitional justice mechanisms and to adopt a human rights regime, which is not always easy. On the local level, they want to be actually accepted as a righteous party in the conflict. So as we saw in Jelena's presentation, as we heard in Jelena's presentation, we see those competing narratives. It is very, very, very rare you can find now post-conflict states that are willing to say, yes, we did bad things, it was not okay. I mean, it takes time, those are processes, it's always fragmented and always selected. So there is this huge gap in between those opposing demands at the international level and on the local level. We see that collective memory is not as it used to be, or at least official memory run by state-sponsored memory projects such as commemorations and textbooks and national calendars, monuments. Once it was only for the purpose of forging national, local identities. Now it has actually real impact in the international politics. So I want to present here Serbia as an exemplary case for this matter, because we can see that I think that what happened in this gap between those colliding demands, that actually the ruling political elite in Serbia produced new mechanisms that actually changed the content of memory. And I will explain what I mean by that. I will address here 3 particular mechanisms. One is decontextualization of collective memory, in particular of war veterans' memory. Second is creation of narratives of suffering, and I will address to something that Jelena also was talking about. And the third mechanism is the use of Holocaust memory discourse as a screen memory. All those mechanisms, I suggest, are made in order to reduce the tension that exists between those opposing demands at the international level versus those at the local level. On the other hand, all those mechanisms are also mechanisms of silencing open political debate. They disable political debate. And political debate about, when I talk about political debate, I mean about facing the past, like openly starting a process of taking responsibility for the atrocities that happened during the wars of the 90s. In my point of view, the state or the ruling political elite has to be on the top of this process and has to support this process. On the contrary, in the case of Serbia, we see that actually the ruling political elite, and I mean from 2000 till today, is actually taking this, is making, not always consciously and not always premeditated, but making those mechanisms to silence this debate. So I will briefly go through those 3 mechanisms. The first mechanism of decontextualization is actually addresses the process where concrete memories are reduced to abstract memories. So you take out, for example, you take a content out of it and you make it as an empty category. So I took, I cannot go now in much of a detail about each case study, but I was analyzing how war veterans in Serbia were applying for budgets, and were actually this decontextualizations was done through the format of this call for projects. And not only they were decontextualized by the attempt of the call for paper to frame them and limit their ability to endorse certain memories, they were also placed in very certain position that they can get budgets only in 2 possible ways. Either if they're promoting liberal, character of the wars, liberation character of the wars, or if they need some kind of PTSD rehabilitation. So war veterans none of them got actually budgets at the end for promoting liberation character of the wars. Those who got budgets on that account were either partisans from the Second World War, organizations of partisans, or organizations of Balkan wars, and organizations of Chetniks. This is very interesting to see how democracy works. You know, we have that pretense that many different memory agendas are promoted. When you get into it, you actually see that there is some kind of attempt to strengthen a category of liberation war, strengthen some kind of attachment, general attachment that yes, we are a state and you have to fight because this is your homeland. But on the other hand, you cannot say anything specific about the wars. War veteran organizations from the wars of the 90s, and I cannot get into there are many war veteran organizations. They could have, and they got only budgets if they were talking about PTSD rehabilitations. So they had to frame their memories as victim-side memories. They were the victims. And I will talk in next mechanism why victims is such a suitable category, and you also asked that question in the previous panel. So first mechanism is actually taking out some concrete memory. You cannot see anyone identifying itself as an organization, saying, for example, everything is very generic. So you have homeland warriors, you have soldiers from the wars of the 90s. You don't get where, you don't get what. It's not like they're going to really address any concrete memory, not a battlefield, not some hero. Everything is empty of a content. And this is precisely what suits actually the ruling political elite, because that is how it succeeded actually in reducing the most biggest population, which is a veteran population here that really has an agency as a mnemonic group. The second mechanism is, I actually tried to see how those narratives of suffering are created. And I took, again, another state-sponsored memory project, the National Calendar. And there it is interesting because you can see that it was purposefully all the important memory events that were took into considerations had to deal either to a democratic character of Serbia or to its victimhood character. We can see that the main commemorative narrative has been moved to the 19th century, also because, and it's not only my analysis, you can see, for example, just one small citation to tell you. For example, we needed to adapt it to local needs and to align it with international standards, to align national calendar with international standards. What a kind of a... And with similar programs established by governments in many other European countries. This was said by the advisor of the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. So you see there is a real attempt to adjust national calendar to construct really what is the image we want to perform or to show for the international display. And there is another thing that I think that should be addressed, why victimization? And it is not only why, as like you asked, why they choose victimization and not collaboration or any other narrative. I think it has to do with several things. First of all, for the internal purposes, within the states, small states, post-conflict states that are really placed in that gap between international domestic demands, picking up on that victimization narrative is I would say, the most clever thing to do. They cannot choose to be villains. They obviously don't want to sell themselves as villains, but they cannot also choose to be heroes, because you know what is going on here. You cannot now go officially and say Ratko Mladic was the hero. So in the space that has been left there, it's about. So you see that choosing or picking up a victim as a narrative is the only reasonable or logical thing to do. There is another thing about choosing this victim position. Okay, I'll come to it later, sorry. So, in many sense, I think that we can see that in many different narratives of victimhood, that Serbia is behaving like a job applicant that is looking good and lying to do it. I mean, it's always, everything is about how do I look on the outside and what do I do inside, and it affects memory content and memory politics in all different levels. Holocaust, this is my third mechanism I want to address here. Holocaust, and here I have to go to some really small anecdote. I really thought it has nothing to do with my research. I thought, okay, when I was interviewing war veterans and other different memory agents, I thought that, okay, they're talking to me about Holocaust because my name is Lea David, I'm coming from Israel, and it's something like you have that kind of a reflection that you have to like whip it away and you say, no, it doesn't have to do with me. But at the end, I understood it is much bigger picture. And I think this is really amazing. Serbia is now very much proud about its Holocaust education. Everything that has to do with Holocaust is now, I would say, multiplied in a you can see much of her research, you can see it in commemorations. There are 3 commemorative dates that are somehow connected to Jewish or to Holocaust or to anti-Semitism, and it is really amazing. And it is actually, like Jelena said, it is in order to equate Serbian victimhood with Jewish victimhood, which is, I think there are probably here people who are dealing with human rights and minority rights, and it tackles the heart of that problem, because it does exactly the opposite. The story goes like this, and I will tell it really briefly. You have Serbian Orthodox Church, you have the ruling political elite, and you have the Yad Vashem Museum in Israel. All those together were actually responsible for bringing up or enforcing the Holocaust memory or memory discourse as is now in Serbia. And it is as is just to equate Serbian victims with Jewish victims, and not to say, okay, we have to learn something from the Holocaust about human rights in global. So this is really something that has to be taken into a policy level, and I think in that sense that Serbian Orthodox Church is a part of the problem and not its solution, because it has, I mean, whoever wants to read it, really the whole analysis, I can send it, of course. So I just want to finish my paper to say what are actually the implications of those mechanisms. So first of all, we see that memory has become a resource, very useful resource, and in particular within the weak states or post-conflict weak states. It is a resource, you can trade it, you can make all kind. It became a currency, and very cheap currency, because it is easy to be manipulated. And I think it is something we have to look after and see yes, thank you, of this in all. And I think really many people spoke about it in previous sessions, that you see on the ground that it has a real impact. That's how it goes when you don't read it from the paper. Yes. Last thing, I want to finish it with it. The point I wanted to say previously about the victims. There is generally now kind of a notion that victim is a new hero, and it is not only here in Serbia, it is everywhere. It is a kind of a part of a global politics. So this is another reason why it is so easy to pick up on victim or victimization narrative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah, for highlighting some of the fantastic points that you make in your paper, and I'm sure it will be available and published at some point. Also, I think your paper adds quite interesting insights into the norm diffusion literature that has been quite prominent in recent times. With no further ado, we move now to the second paper by Kalina Yordanova, and the title of the paper is Images of War, the Place of the War Past of the Presence in the Second Generation's Identity. So we move from Serbia to Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for expressing interest in my paper. I will take it to a slightly different direction because I'm a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist, and I would provide a more psychoanalytically informed view on trauma and war. And this particular paper comes from my field work in Bosnia in 2012 as part of my doctoral project when I was researching the transmission of experience across generations. And for the purposes of this presentation, I shall focus on two main questions. The first being, what images of war do children of survivors create in order to grasp the past of their parents? And the second, how are these images shaping their identity? I will outline my main hypothesis, and I will say a few words about my methodology. Sorry. And then I will present the core of the paper. I will need a few slides to show you, so in the middle of the presentation I may jump to the computer to just show you some of the drawings, because my paper relies on participant observation, interviews, but also to children's drawings, and this is essential to understanding the content of the paper. The hypothesis I draw on, and this came from my original research in Bosnia, is that survivor parents do not talk about the war. They would rather show things instead of create a war narrative in the first person. This means that they transmit their experiences of war through war jokes, bodily symptoms, war-related illness. As you mentioned, PTSD is one of the very hot issues in post-war societies. Art objects, items they make, and also items they link to the war, which comes in the form of a very fragmented experience that is delivered to the second generation, and the second generation must make sense of it by filling the gaps of knowledge with their own imagination, and this is what I'm going to research. So why wouldn't parents create a consistent narrative in the first person about the war? Why is it problematic to tell a story in the first person to their children? I've singled out 4 reasons as they came out of my research. The first being their perception of the war as a sudden event, as a surreal realm that just befell them and didn't leave much space for reflection. Which leaves them with the suspicion that if they tell a story about the war, even to their children, the children won't be able to understand it because they didn't have first-hand experience themselves. The second reason is the ambiguity of their experience of war. I very rarely found a person who had only one perspective on the war. They normally switched from different positions, and I would give an example with the war veterans, who were normally in the position of a perpetrator, but also they witnessed violence, and very often they were victimized. So if there is no clear-cut position from which you view your experience, it's very difficult to deliver it to the next generation and problematically. The third reason is the experience of the uncanny, and I'm heavily drawing on a paper written by Freud in 1919 with the same title, The Uncanny, which means that there is something about the experience of extreme violence which remains out of the possibilities of speech. There is something which cannot be easily symbolized. And finally, and this relates particularly to the Bosnian context in my experience, the last reason for not creating a narrative in the first person is the clear-cut story which is reinforced by the current political context in Bosnia, which leaves out other narratives, other possible perspectives on the war. Which means that complexity of experience is kind of denied. There is one official story and the rest, which doesn't fall within the scope of the story, is left outside the picture. So when faced with this kind of absence of a narrative and in the framework of their daily interaction with their parents, children try to seek information themselves about the history of the family so that they can identify with their family and feel a descendant of a given family at a given moment. And when I asked them to make a drawing of the war the way they imagined it in order to understand how they grasped the past of their parents, they created 5 different metaphors, 5 different images of the war. And I'm going to show this now to you. I'm sorry, but I don't have other option but to show it. I will just, it's all right, I will show the audience. So this is part of my methodology. You can see the genogram. This is how I research the patterns across generations. This is a lifeline. This is part of my participant observations. These are war veterans. They normally go to places where they serve the front. These are objects they create. This is a drawing made by a war veteran. Now, these are the children's drawings. This is a drawing of a girl aged 6. And this is the breakup of her country. This is the breakup of Yugoslavia. This is how she imagined it. This is Sarajevo under siege. There is another drawing. This is the family house. I'll show all of it and then I will discuss it so that I don't stand here.
You can stand here and you can...
Okay, yeah, please do. I will move to the first one, which I want to discuss. Leave it like this for a while. So the first metaphor of the war I obtained when I asked them to present, thank you, when I asked them to present the image of the war the way they imagined it, was this kind of monochromic outline of the city, which didn't involve any action. There weren't people in the streets. And I was asking myself, why would children imagine the war in that schematic kind of map-like way? Because from my therapeutic experience, if you ask a small child to make a war drawing, it will be full of action, colors, people fighting, so on and so forth. And I started understanding these drawings in the context of contemporary war. If you think of the two-dimensional images seen from drones or from snipers, this is what you get. There are no humans. Humans are reduced to moving targets. And I believe that these images can be understood in the context of what present-day war is like, and it differs from the way we used to know the war from before, where humans are reduced to targets and perpetrators are reduced to executioners. Or this is kind of the dehumanizing aspect of contemporary war, which came out of these drawings because there is this interaction between the intimate levels of transmission and the collective levels, where you have cultural representations of war available in film, in idiom, and so on and so forth. And one last hypothesis related to these drawings, I suggest that they do not provide an insight to the interior of the object. Or in other words, they do not give us an idea about relationship and connectedness, because this is what is probably most destroyed during the war, right? If I'm making a clear point here. And I want to move to the next. Yes, this is the next metaphor of the war I obtained, the family house. What is striking here, that there is no sign of war. You get a house, it's locked, there are metal grids, it's surrounded by a fence, but it doesn't show any signs of war taking place. However, the narrative that accompanies it is full of war narratives, or fragments of war narrative. So I was wondering, why would young children in particular opt for the house, the family house, as a metaphor of the war? And since it was opted by young children and girls in particular, I can speculate that in first place, the house is very important for small children because it represents their entire universe. What a young child considers to be his or her world is basically the family. And if you think of the word in Serbo-Croatian for house, which is kuća, it doesn't mean only the building itself, but also the family unit that inhabits it. So basically the attack on the family house is perceived as equal to death. So this is why it came out as a war metaphor. But why so colorful and decorated? If you see the house, it's completely different from what we saw in the previous slide, which was monochromic. It's full of colors. It's even kind of beautiful. There is some garden in the back, in the background. So I thought that this is a way of masking horror and also prettifying horror in order not to... Children were focusing on the smallest detail while making these drawings, only not to think of what the war might really look like. The next metaphor of the war, I've entitled Survival at the Expense of Integrity. This is an image I got from a boy, 11-year-old boy, as a response to my instruction to make a portrait of his father during the war. The father served the front, though. The father is a war veteran. So the boy only made his arm. Later on in the narrative, it turned out that apart from being a soldier, therefore holding a gun, the father also became a drug addict after the war, and he did inject the heroin in his arms. So by showing you this, I want to make one point, and this is that many survivors experienced post-war marginalization after the war, and the way their children perceived them was as part object, rather fragmented, rather disconnected. And there is one part of the person, one part of the body which stands for the whole, but is never complete. And these type of drawings do represent this post-war fragmentation as a metaphor of war. Or in other words, what does the war bring to us? It brings fragmentation and disconnection. Next one. That's my favorite. I entitled it Dirty Job and Heroes because the narrative about the heroes is very strong, as we saw in the previous presentation. Particularly in Bosnia, there is this narrative going on, the official, that the veterans, the soldiers were heroes, they defended the home, and so on and so forth. But when you explore the second generation's imagery of this, you see that this is, I will tell you a bit about the story because it's very telling. The girl who is 6-year-old told me that the father, this represents the father coming back from the front. He's picking up flowers because the war is over. But he got so dirty that he needs to be washed. And this 1, 2, 3 numbers represent the parking lot with the cars who went to the car wash because they also got dirty during the war. So you can see how the heroic gets tightly bound to the horrific in the imagery of the second generation. And it came out in one quote I'm going to give you now. Of course, in older children, this is much more explicit. There is this 15-year-old boy who told me, my father doesn't talk about the war. He has only showed me the places where he served the front. We normally go with friends to play in the trenches. I asked him whether he had killed, but he didn't give me an answer. So there's always the suspicion that our parents, who were probably heroes, were also murderers. And the last metaphor, this one and this one. What you can see is that some of the figures are faceless. Here the victims, here also the victim, but also the murderers, they only have eyes. And this is not at first I thought it's a problem of representation when I obtained this from small children, but this is 15-year-old girl, so obviously she knew how a human body looked. She obviously could make a human figure. And I thought, why wouldn't this figure have a face? And then when I researched the psychoanalytic literature on this, and also if you think of anthropological accounts on how the executioner's face is hidden by a hood and the victim's face is blindfolded, I thought that there is something about pure horror which cannot be symbolized. And this is where the gaps of knowledge are open and they're still not filled in by the second generation's imagery. In other words, there is something which cannot be remembered by the generation of the victims and therefore cannot be imagined by the generation of the children. And just quickly linking all this to the identity issue, because this was how I promised to link the issue of trauma and war to identity formation. What came out of my research was a high level of ambiguity in the second generation towards self-history and the domestic. Because on the one hand, they felt sympathy and compassion for the generation of the parents who had suffered and fought during the war. But on the other hand, there was also accusation for having robbed the future generations of the opportunities they would have had if there hadn't been a war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalina, not just for this presentation, but also for keeping within the time limit. So now we move from the primary socialization, psychoanalytical accounts of memory reproduction to a very top-down approach. And we will move to the third panelist, Aleksandar Sazdovski, who will talk about nation building under the societal security dilemma, and he will use the case of Macedonia for that. Aleksandar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful event. My article looks at the interplay between security policy and nation building in the Macedonian context, or rather, how have societal security concerns impact the nation-building project in Macedonia? So I start from the assumption of the Copenhagen School of Security Studies, which argues that in order to understand the logic of societal security, it is necessary to study the process when a group comes to perceive its identity as being threatened. It begins to act in security mode on this basis, and what kind of behavior this triggers. So the focus of my article is the ongoing nation-building project in Macedonia that became known as Antiquization. And more specifically, I'm looking at the Skopje 2014 project, which envisioned an urban reconstruction of the city through a series of monuments of historical and religious figures, and as well as public buildings resembling a neoclassical or neo-Baroque style. So the purpose of this antiquization process and the Skopje 2014 project was to reconstruct and to redefine Macedonian national identity by stressing a linear continuity of this identity from antiquity to the present, and thereby emphasizing the nation's unceasing existence throughout the ages. So my article basically looks at what were the underlying causes that shaped the nation-building process, how have historical, political, and other factors influenced the nation-building project, and finally, why was ancient Macedonia and the ancient Macedonians chosen as the narrative around which the nation-building project could take place. So in my article, I forward the claim that the nation-building project in Macedonia was developed in response to external and internal perceived identity threats. So what does it mean? Namely, since declaring independence, Macedonia has been facing what I term as a double societal security dilemma, which was an external one, stemming from Macedonia's immediate neighbors who recognized and accepted the existence of the new state. However, each of them denied a segment in which Macedonian national identity was defined. And the second, internal societal security dilemma, which was posed by Macedonia's domestic ethnic Albanian population, which constantly challenged the ethnic Macedonian character of the new state. So I will now briefly outline both of these dilemmas, and then I will go more into detail of the antiquization process and the Skopje 2014 project. So when Macedonia declared independence in 1991, Republic of Bulgaria was the first country to officially recognize the new state. However, from the beginning, it made it explicitly clear that it did not recognize the existence of a distinct Macedonian nation and language, and instead argued that the Macedonians were actually a part of the Bulgarian nation, and the Macedonian language is merely a dialect of the Bulgarian language. Serbia, in its own regard, recognized the existence of the Macedonian nation and the existence of the Macedonian state. However, it denied the existence of autonomous and autocephalous Macedonian Orthodox Church, which is seen as an integral part of Macedonia's self-identification, and this implicitly was accepted as a kind of a negation of existence of a Macedonian national identity. On the other hand, Albania recognized the existence of the Macedonian nation and the existence of the state. However, it maintained that the new state does not belong exclusively to the Macedonians. And finally, the most complex issue and the most complex relationship has been with the Republic of Greece, who in turn recognized the existence of the new state and recognized the Slavic nation as a distinct nation. However, it argued that the Slavic nation has misappropriated the use of the name Macedonia, a name that was, is, and always will be Greek. So the relationship between the two countries became seriously worsened in 2008 when Greece decided to veto and to block Macedonia's entrance into the NATO at the summit at Bucharest, which was seen as a humiliation in Macedonia, basically. And from here on, security concerns started to really emerge in Macedonian public discourse. So at the same time, internally, the Macedonian character of the state was constantly being challenged by Macedonia's domestic ethnic Albanian population. So from the beginning, since declaring independence, Macedonian political elites were determined about a Macedonian character of the state, and they decided to construct the constitution in a manner that would protect Macedonian national identity. As a result, this was severely challenged by the ethnic Albanians in Macedonia, who decided to boycott the constitution and also decided to boycott previously the referendum for independence, and instead organized a parallel unofficial referendum for the establishment of the Republic of Ilirida in the western part of Macedonia, where predominantly ethnic Albanians lived. And what is interesting is that several days ago, I think it was 10 days ago, the political actors that initiated this referendum in 1992, the president of the then biggest ethnically Albanian party, re-emerged claiming that the Republic of Ilirida is still a reality and it's just waiting for the right opportunity to be established. Macedonia's security concerns were further intensified in 2001 when a small-scale armed conflict occurred between the National Liberation Army, which was an ethnically Albanian paramilitary organization, and the Macedonian security forces, which lasted for about 6 months. It was very small scale, but it did have some implications. The conflict was ended with the signing of the Ohrid Framework Agreement in 2001, and which essentially sought to transform Macedonia from an ethnic nation state into a multi-ethnic sort of civic state. This framework agreement was immediately became part of a heated public debate, and it was very much challenged and opposed by ethnic Macedonians who saw the Macedonian state, or rather the ethnic Macedonian character of the state, as the only protector of Macedonian national identity in an international climate when such an identity is not recognized by its international immediate surroundings. So the altered character of the Macedonian state, which was engendered with the Ohrid Framework Agreement, was seen as a further weakening of the base of Macedonian national identity. So, following the logic of the societal security dilemma, when one society is threatened in terms of its identity, it then reacts and responds by trying to protect itself, by strengthening its identity, usually by cultural means, to reinforce social cohesion and distinctiveness through the use of indigenous national myths and symbols. So when in 2006 the government of VMRO DPMNE, which is still in power in Macedonia, came to power, they initiated a kind of a new nation building project which stressed a link and a linear continuity of Macedonian national identity and of the Macedonian nation from the antiquity to the present. And in support of this process, the airport, the national airport, was renamed Aleksandar Makedonski. Several statues of the classical period were erected in front of the government building. Various textbooks, government-sponsored textbooks, were published that also supported this position. And I would like to also add a kind of a personal experience. While I was doing my BA in political science in Skopje, we had a course in political theory in the antique world, in antiquity, and the book contained more than 250 pages on ancient Macedonia and every king, literally from the beginning to the end, was enumerated, and all the lines of Macedonian kings and sons and whatever were outlined in the book. And what is interesting is that the book was written by the current Macedonian president, President Georgi Ivanov, who is like an avid supporter of this process. After 2008, as I mentioned, after the summit in Bucharest, when questions of identity again came to the fore, the antiquization process became much more assertive. And subsequently, the stadium in Skopje was renamed into the National Arena Philip II, and the main highway, which was part of the European Corridor 10, was also renamed Aleksandar the Great. In addition, the process was accompanied by government-sponsored public campaigns, and two of these campaigns immediately come to my mind. The first one being Macedonia Timeless, which was a series of videos representing different parts of Macedonian culture and Macedonian history. And the second one being titled "You Are Macedonia!" ! Which was basically a poster depicting an ancient Macedonian warrior pointing towards the viewer and saying, "You are Macedonia!" ! However, most explicitly, this process was embodied in the Skopje 2014 project, which was a cultural project, and it's highly debated in Macedonia still, and it's considered as very controversial. And the whole project kind of created a mythical representation of Macedonian national identity by moving back from the present into an idealized and selective version of the past. So why the purpose of my paper was to show why was ancient Macedonia chosen as the point in the Skopje 2014 project. So namely, what I argue is that tracing the roots of the Macedonian nation to antiquity satisfied the quest for authenticity and self-identification as well as uniqueness, which was missing in the narrative of Macedonian national identity. And more importantly, it disputed the claims of neighboring Slavic nations by highlighting the pre-Slavic origins of the Macedonian nations. So basically, this would mean the logic would go that if the Macedonians were pre-Slavic or are not Slavic, then how can they be part of the Bulgarian or Serbian nation who are indeed Slavic? Or this is how their narratives go. Furthermore, by tracing the roots of the Macedonian nation into antiquity, this means that the ancestors of the Macedonians inhabited the territory that is currently inhabited by Macedonians, previously to the ancestors of the other neighboring countries, the ancestors of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Albania. And at the same time, this would mean that Macedonians have more and natural rights to the territory which they inhabit as autochthonous and indigenous peoples. And this in turn would dispute the claims by ethnic Albanians who wanted equal ownership of the state. Finally, the project also addressed the naming dispute with Greece by implicitly establishing the presence of the Macedonian name, or the name Macedonia, and the use of the name Macedonia for that region and people throughout all the periods of history. So this is where I will end the presentation. I will conclude that in the Antiquization process and the Skopje 2014 project, the narrative of ancient Macedonia was used to generate a strong feeling of self-identification and identity, which has been disputed by Macedonia's immediate neighbors. And thus, in this process and the Skopje 2014 project, ancient Macedonia was seen as the golden age and a link to a glorious past around which, in the face of, as I said, external and internal identity threats, this new nation-building process could take place. In the end, I would like to close my presentation with a quote from Macedonia's current Prime Minister, who described the Skopje 2014 project. Open quote, "The main driving power of each success is the national spirit. The love for one's past and inherited values has raised many nations from the ashes. Skopje 2014 puts an end to Macedonia without monuments, accompanied by constant denials of our nation, language, identity, and history." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aleksandar, of reminding us how a small nation can become a great one, or at least of the great. And also another comment I'd like to make, maybe not a great idea when historians become presidents, which didn't only just happen in Macedonia. But it's not my role to comment. For that, we have Professor Jim Soraka, and I'd like to pass on the floor to you.
Thank you. I want to first start off to say how impressed I am with the papers presented in this panel and in the prior two panels. It's very unusual to have a continuity within a panel, not to mention a continuity across three panels, and I congratulate all the paper givers at this point. Let me start off with some comments about each of the papers. With Dr. David's paper, this is, it was a very interesting piece with a lot of interesting questions. How do you create a national myth of a lost war where you cannot glorify the participants, you cannot identify who the victimizer is, and you have no heroes? And that becomes a very serious historical and national problem. I disagree a little bit with the implication of Leah's paper that the political elites planned this interpretation of history. I don't think it was a plan. I don't think it was a conspiracy. I think it just was an incremental set of decisions that led one from another, that basically had to deal with competing visions and competing images that led to this approach. Now, in Serbia, there's a tradition of suffering and betrayal that goes back to 1389. You really can't pay attention to Serbian culture without being aware of the concept of betrayal, defeat, and then rising from the ashes. The Kosovo Fields in 1389, of course, is the best known, but there's also the memory of the First World War and the horrific retreat, and later with the victory of the Serb soldiers. I think one of the problems, not that I have with the paper, but that I'd like you to look at in the future, is that the traditional or the easiest mythology that could have been developed is the mythology that the West has, that Serbia was led astray by a bad man, and through the heroic efforts of the people, the Zajedno movement, the revolution, the martyrdom of Zoran Đinđić and others, they created an honorable Serbian state. And what's intriguing is that Serbia hasn't moved in that direction, which would have been the easiest for the European Union, the United States, and the Western world to accept. The methodology you use of looking at the veterans associations and the projects they apply for, I think is really fascinating. I had never thought about that as a way to really, understand what's happening. And I think that's, something that you ought to explore a little bit more, and I would hope that other scholars who are dealing with conflict societies look at as well. What do you do for veterans when you can't build monuments? And you can't have historic films, etc. I don't think the narrative is closed. Your paper has an implication of this is it. And there are competing narratives out there, and many of them have gone underground, just like the partisan victory in 1945 was the official narrative, but the Draža Mihailović and the Chetniks survived for 50 years or so as a competing kind of narrative. I would really like to see your work expanded on not so much the national myth narrative, but other ways of interpreting the war. The role of the opposition, the redefinition of the 1999 NATO war against what was then still Yugoslavia, and the transition from the Milosevic period. Last point I have is I think the Holocaust may be overstated as a important issue in this. From the Serb perspective, the idea is we're not alone. Other people have been victimized over centuries as well. Jews among them, Armenians, Poles. I think every Slavic nation has a long history of being victimized. And in the case of Serbia, the Holocaust, I don't think will ring true over a long period of time. I just think of, for example, the old what's it called? Fairgrounds, thank you. English is my native language, and I still can't get it right. Which was the site of a camp during the Second World War, where Jews and Roma and others were transited out of Serbia to other places. The other part is, the mythology, not mythology, but the fact of Jews such as Moshe Piade and others who were fighting against Serbian nationalists because of their Jewish identity. I think it's something that you ought to take a look at and really treat the paper as this is where the flow of the narrative now, but the concept is it could change in the future. Moving to Dr. Yordanova's paper. I'm less qualified to discuss the methodology. I asked my colleagues in psychology and got some really strong reactions, both positive and negative. So I'm staying away from any discussion of the methodology. But the question you look at, I think, is fascinating. How do children interpret the Bosnian War when the family doesn't discuss it, when friends and neighbors don't have different experiences and won't discuss it, when the history books don't talk about it, and when it was very, very personal? And it's a concept of how the children pick up pieces here and there, and it may not be accurate, but they have to build their own narrative. This is in very sharp contrast to the post-World War II period in Bosnia, where you had a victor, the partisans, and a coherent narrative in the schools and film, etc. I spent a good amount of my time watching, films like the Battle in Neretva, Sutjesta, Walter Brani, Sarajevo. I must have seen that a dozen times. My son was 6 years old at the time. But there's nothing comparable in Bosnia. The 5 images of reconstruction I think you have are very reasonable. But again, I can't judge if your interpretation is correct or not. And what I would suggest is that you use more varied evidence from other sources and from other approaches for confirmation of what you're looking at. The last thing, which is outside this paper, but which I would really like to see, is the Bosnian children experience the same or different than the experience of children in Lebanon or Colombia or Nicaragua or the Algerian Civil War? I think there's a real concept that let's go beyond the immediate case and see how it what the full theoretical story is. And the last part is, and this is I think more with what your profession is what should be done to help the psychological health of children impacted this way. And I think that's the real lesson. The third paper by Mr. Sazdovski, again, I really, really liked. This was extremely well written. It discusses the creation of a state when you have threats from the outside, threats from within. You have an excellent presentation of the contemporary dynamics of the Macedonian question. I really appreciate how Aleksandar goes from state to state to state in the region and defines their position vis-a-vis the Macedonian identity. You imply that this building project and this whole set of going back to Philip of Macedon is not going to be successful. And I agree with you, but I would like to see some evidence that it's not being accepted by the Macedonian population. I'd also like to see a suggestion of what alternatives exist. And this is a policy kind of question rather than a theoretical question that could bring the country together, not as just the Macedonian ethnic group, but the entire country. For non-Macedonians, your paper explains a lot. Why the name dispute continues on and on and on, and why it won't be solved by capitulation of the Macedonian position. And then I want to conclude with a comment that deals with the accusation that North Americans don't have a sense of history and memory, which I agree is correct. We don't. And several years ago, I was speaking to a workshop of military colonels and Navy captains, and I was trying to explain the Macedonian name issue, prior to the decision of NATO not to admit Macedonia. And I had a 3-hour brilliant presentation. And I thought I really got the point across. And then a colonel came up to me at the coffee break and said, Professor, the problem here is that the Macedonians have too much history. They need to get over it. Memory and history is a heavy burden to overcome. And my conclusion is not that someone should get over it, but we, the scholars in the outside world, really shouldn't expect history to reflect the truth, at least not an objective truth. In sort of paraphrasing William Shakespeare, like beauty, truth is in the eye of the beholder, and history is in the eye of the beholder. Thank you.
Thank you. If only scholars were listened to. at least occasionally. If you can hold your breath for a moment, I suggest we go around the audience to ask for perhaps the first round of questions, maybe 2-3 questions, and then we'll go around the panel. Who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
Thank you all. My name is Mladen Mrdalj. I'm working on my dissertation as well, so I know some pains of the research. For Professor Seroka, you asked, what do you do when with veterans when you cannot build monuments? It's a funny thing. Across Serbia, there is a bunch of partisan monuments, and you can see a lot of plaques attached to them to the fighters who died in the 1990s war in 1990. And it would be a fascinating topic to research how these two are connected, because it's in a way implies for the local population in these towns that those who died fighting in the World War II against Nazis are the same sort of way guys as the guys who fought, who died fighting NATO, which then has a certain implication about Nazis and NATO. And the question for Leah, I'm curious if you have visited the Museum of Genocide in Belgrade or Serbia. And I'm curious to see if you have discovered that Museum of Genocide in Serbia, because I tried to take some students to visit Museum of Genocide in Serbia, and there is none.
No, it's a virtual museum. It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, yes. No, so something to learn from Jewish commemoration of Holocaust for Serbs would be to actually build a museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1 or 2 more, if there are any immediate comments or questions. No? Then I'll ask a question to Kalina. If you can perhaps say whether or not the images were different from children in different families. So in different majority nations, the constituent nations, as well as the others. And also, given the fact that the children were, of course, of different ages, so some of them would be at schools, whether or not the fact that they probably came from different areas had an impact on their images. Because we know that education in Bosnia and Herzegovina is pretty much regulated at the local level. So the cantons are responsible, or the Republika Srpska. So if the circumstances have affected the images of the children. I suggest we go in the same order. Perhaps Leah, if you can start.
Okay, thank you, Professor Seroka. I really appreciate your comments, because it helps me understand what I miss in those papers. Okay, first of all, I also said it, I don't think it was pre-planned, and I don't think that it was instrumentalized in that matter, that there is really something like political elite, and they sit together and they have lunch and they say, what we are going to do with this memory issue. No, but there was a certain tendency not to open political spaces for an open debate about the wars of the 90s. And this was a byproduct. Okay, it was not like they were sitting and what we are going to do, but it was kind of a policy not to give budgets to the war veterans, not to give them an open stage to talk about it. On the contrary, just to every certain benefit that war veterans received, they received it with a condition not to talk openly on what they got. So I mean, I couldn't bring everything here, obviously. First World War, that is, I think, a great point, and still it's not here, but I analyzed it more in national calendar, because First World War became kind of like a Holocaust card for Israelis. It's a First World War for Serbs. It's like, this is our debt. You own us. European Union, listen to us. You own us. This is what we sacrificed. Again, from that narrative, from small states, weak states, border states, who owns us what? So in that sense, I think, again, we can see memory content as being traded for something else. So it's, and I certainly agree with you that this is not like kind of, this is the narrative. This is the process. This is what is going on now. Like, you know, you can pick after the Second World War in Germany, you can pick any single point in the time, you will see that they have different narrative for that particular moment. So, of course, but I'm just trying to point out here that the main tendency of the political elite is to deal with its contested past by covers up and by reframing, and not by opening and discussing what happened in an open manner. Monuments, okay, this is also for you. Actually, my PhD was about veteran monuments, so I know really a lot about it. And you say there are many partisan monuments with plagues for... You have no idea how many monuments in Belgrade you have for veterans in the wars of the 90s. They're invisible. No one knows they exist. They're like... Just if you are not connected to it, you will not see it. I can go to Tashmaidan Park. There you have at least 7, but no one knows that because you don't see them. You don't see them because you are not connected to them. And there is only one, actually 2, but only one monument in the heart of Belgrade that was built as a part of an open call, which makes it really special, and that is the one on in Picin Park, in well, you know. Really, it is there, a very unpleasant place to put a monument. And even if you go there, it was opened only 2 years ago. And when what inaugurated on 24th of April, the start of NATO bombing. So it was kind of, to point out that we are the real victims here. And still, if you go there, you will not see it. You will not. It is made in such a ambiguous way. It is like it is invisible. But we can talk about again, when you don't have a strong narrative, what do you do with that? So everyone is taking the main monument is called Monument for Defenders and the Victims of the Wars of the 90s. Together, you put them together, like who? From whole Yugoslavia, only Serbian. So it's many questions about that. It was 3 times call for this project, and very long story. 10 years it took to build this monument, and at the end, of course, some political issues were there to promote actually the monument itself. Holocaust. You're right, but this is exactly my point. If you see how the Holocaust remembrance is actually neglected, and how some kind of a pretense of Holocaust discourse is raised, this is actually what makes me worried, because it is used only as a screen memory, as like, we are now going to talk about Holocaust. We are not going to talk about the wars of the 90s. Why about the Holocaust? Because, again, like Jelena said, we think that Serbs were on the good side during the World War II. We know that Serbs were helping Jews during the World War II. And those are our points to the European Union. This is, look, we were on the side of the goodies. So this is the whole issue here. So they teach it in that way. It's empty of any ideology of human rights. Because on the ground you see that you see Sajmište. I mean, nothing has been done for ages. So, but this gap is actually what I find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laya. Kalina?
Thank you for questions. I will only share a few thoughts regarding the methodology. Of course, I'm not going to go in detail here. But I know that psychoanalytical methods do sound speculative, and I'm not going to now prove their validity. I would only mention some of the tests, for instance, Rorschach's projective test, which is one of the most reliable methodologies known in psychology. It comes from this idea of externalizing the internal content through an image. As for your questions, thank you for that. That would be really good to see whether this can be compared to other research done in Lebanon or in other places where there's been violence and how children create metaphors. It's been done indeed. Similar piece of work has been done after the Holocaust. For instance, I would mention Marianne Hirsch in the US and her work on post-memory, as well as Heidi Feinberg and her work on telescoping generations. She is talking about these phenomena, and there are other scholars. As for the images, do they differ? I would say that they differ according to age, because preschool children tend to be more spontaneous and they give a more open kind of personal account, while school children would be more affected by the official discourse which is taught in schools, regardless of whether they come from. So you can first see the official discourse and then they go slowly into more intimate detail. And of course families differ from each other because, but not, I wouldn't, because I didn't research the ethnic dimension. So the difference came from which kind of metaphor was dominant in the parents' experience. For instance, if there was someone sick in the family, if depression or some other illness was dominant, then the metaphor used by children would link directly to disability and fragmentation. If there's been execution and death in the family, then the images would link more to the schematic images of war and faceless horror. So it depends more on the narratives available in the family rather than on the ethnic background. Okay.
Thank you. Aleksandar?
Yeah. I would like to thank Professor Seroka for the wonderful comments, and it has been really flattering to hear all those nice things that you said. Regarding your questions about evidence of support or in Macedonia about the 2014 project, I would like to add two interesting comments. So there have been in recent years some research conducted, kind of a public opinion research conducted in regards to the Skopje 2014 project, and we have like two branches. One is government sponsored and the other one is independent. And the government sponsored, you obviously know the answer. The project is always supported and all of this, but in the independent research shows that the population, the research has been done 2 years ago by an Institute of Social Science Research, and has the questions revolved through identification with people from Macedonian history. So the results showed that Macedonian people identified themselves more with people and persons from closer historical ages, people from the Ottoman period like Goce Delchev, or people from even closer history like Metodi Andonov Cento, who was the first president of People's Republic of Macedonia after the Second World War. And even more interestingly, usually the second place fell to the Saint Cyril and Methodius from the Middle Ages, and then the ancient figures came like third or fourth. So in a way, this shows that even though this project has been like very aggressive in trying to redefine and reconstruct Macedonian identity, so far it has not been to that extent very successful. And regarding your question about alternatives, two obvious strategies come immediately to my mind. The first one being is to kind of desecuritize Macedonian national identity, to remove the question of Macedonian national identity or the existence of Macedonian national identity from the security discourse, and in this way stop talking about it in terms of existential threats. And the second alternative would be, probably when we already have this kind of project already initiated, is to give it kind of a multicultural, multi-ethnic dimensions and focus on shared history, or perhaps combined history, rather than, because the main problem of the Skopje 2014 project is its ethnocentrism. It's completely, almost like 99% ethnically Macedonian in character. So the obvious kind of counter strategy would be to include some kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic dimensions.
Did you want to add anything? No? Is there any other question or comment? Yeah, at the back, a couple.
Thank you. I have one question which deals with the question, I guess, of time. How much time is needed that alternative narratives can emerge and really be able to dominate those that are now currently presented? I live in Canada for the last 25 years, and to be honest, I was very ignorant about Canadian past. So I literally realized once I was there that actually there are really dark moments in Canadian history, in particular in regards to Canadian natives. And only now, after several generations of change, actually people are talking openly about that. I mean, throughout these periods, there were, of course, individuals trying to enlighten Canadian public, but only now you have this openness to accept the guilt responsibility for the treatment of the natives. So I found this similar, because what was happening to natives is even worse than what we are describing actually in the context of the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And there was another question at the back, another hand at the back. If we can get the microphone, thank you.
A child's mind can be very impressionable while the child is still young. And what a child learns at a very tender age can have a very lasting impression that will determine what the child perceives the world to be. So my question is, would you say that it is what the child learns from the surroundings that will leave the most impression to the child, as per the discussion on the world wars? Or would you say that the role of the media and the surroundings will leave a more lasting impression to the child as the child grows up? Will what the child perceive the world to be as the child is very young, will that leave the most impression to the child, or will the role of the media and the surroundings as the child grows up leave the most impression to the child as the child grows up? What would you say? I believe my question is addressed to Dr. Kalina.
Yeah,
I believe so.
thank you. I see no other hand. Oh, I see Diane, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would be quite useful to introduce the dimension of ideology into all this, because it seems to be pretty much natural that conservatives treat past as the part of present and future. There is no clear link between past generations, present generations, and the future generations, and that link is obviously called tradition. So, for example, you have that we inherit the bad or good qualities, either quarrels or positive things from past generations, and we are somehow obliged to pass them on into the next generation. So the notion of time, actually in conservative ideology, is very different than the notion of time in, let's say, liberal ideology. My question and the comment is this. It seems to be surprising to me that, however, in the post-Yugoslav space, liberal forces insisted on confronting the past. I mean, we know all these ideas and projects about the need to confront the past, suočavanje s prošlošću, right? Which reflected both through actually the issue of responsibility for the war of the 1990s, and through illustration, for example, in Macedonia, it also reflected the communist past. And these were liberals as well. So why would liberals, for example, insist that we discuss the past so much? Why don't they just say, okay, hang on a minute, you know, there is nothing terribly good with the past. We are starting a new age. We are not here to continue the tradition. We are actually looking forward. We are looking into a future. We are modernizers. But it seems this to be a bit of a paradox, isn't it, in this country, that actually everyone is talking about the past and then is angry about this other, using the past in a way which is not, you know, which they disagree with. But basically they're looking into the past rather than to make a clear break with the past. Mm-hmm. And for liberals, I think this we can't explain. I don't think I can, actually.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So thank you also for posing a question, but also offering some of a comment, part of the answer. Perhaps Kalina, if you can say, and then whoever wants to come back to the issue of time, Diane's question.
Am I right in understanding your question as follows? What shapes second generation's imagery of war more? the immediate family in early socialization or media. Is that correct? Okay, so then my answer would be the following. I believe that the early experience in our family creates the screen on which later influences whatever else comes from the social milieu would be projected. Or in other words, this is the context which will shape the later interpretations. So I wouldn't say that the early experience is more important, but it's kind of the more primary is kind of the basic. So we would always compare to what we learned from our parents. So in that respect, if I'm to simplify, yeah, in a way, the early experience in the family would be more important to the way we create and hold our imageries of the past.
Yeah.
I just forgot to answer you one question about the Museum of Genocide. Very briefly, it's a virtual museum, and there is nothing you should, you should not aspire to have that kind of a museum here, because it's actually, I will just give you a reference. You can read more from Jovan Byford. He wrote about this museum, and also something that I wrote also about it, which is, again, part of this Holocaust memory discourse, big performance, is they call them the Jasenovac Committee of the Synod of Bishops of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which also is a part of this was at the beginning part of this Jasenovac Museum, and was now it's directed by Jovan Ćulibrk, who is, in my opinion, one of the biggest agents of this politics of Holocaust pretense. And just one more thing I wanted to say about time. Orly wrote about narratives, alternative narratives, how they actually come to being. And her article is also something indefinite. We don't know if it's going to stick or if it's going to go away. And for your comment about conservatives and liberals, I think that traditionally this division is true, but I think that there is a global, in this global human rights regime, even liberals cannot resist from facing the past, because facing the past is kind of it is based on a false pretense, psychological pretense, that if we as a nation face our crimes, it means we will get to some kind of relief, salvation, whatever it means, although it is fails because it doesn't work the same way as it works with individuals. But I think it is kind of a global infrastructure now that it is impossible not to deal with it, not to deal with your past, not to be engaged in some way.
Would anyone else like to add anything? No? I think it's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that at least part of the explanation, to my mind, is the fact that the conservatives hold the dominant tradition and the dominant narrative of what the past is. And by asking them to face the past, liberals try to subvert the dominant narrative. They try to change it. It's a strategy. It's a subversive strategy of challenging the dominant narrative, which in the end ultimately ends in creation of some other tradition and some other alternative past, which is a paradox in a way. But I think that rationale behind is what I try to at least explain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's also this, it proves that nation building is such an all-encompassing project that once the genie is left out of the bottle, it's impossible to put it back in, and everyone is pretty much involved. That brings us to the end of the third panel. Thank you so much to all the panelists and the discussant. I would also like to join me in thanking not just the organizers, of course, for inviting us, but also the academic program coordinator, Philip Eidus. I think the 3 panels have indeed provided some food for thought. And I think we are all hoping that whoever takes part in the next panels, discussions, roundtables in the next 2 days, that some of the food for thought will be internalized and discussed further. So thank you so much.
Just very quick notes. First, thank you very much for staying until the very end of this part of the academic conference. 2, this is not the end of the academic event. This is only the first part or the beginning. Tomorrow and the day after tomorrow we will continue with the academic sessions, although in a rather closed format. We will have a doctoral seminar tomorrow from 2 o'clock onwards, and we'll have methodological and career development sessions the day after tomorrow. So you're all invited to come and to participate in those events. Although they are officially closed, but we will open our doors for anyone who is keen to know more. And last but not the least, tonight we will have breakout sessions. Please take a look at the agenda. This is not the end of today's program. There is plenty of interesting events going on, including the official receptions. And last but not the least, for all of you who would like to read those papers, most of them, after going through a peer review process, will be published in Journal of Regional Security, in a special issue devoted to collective memories and international security. So keep an eye on our website. It's regionalsecurityjournal.com. It's an open access journal, and in the upcoming months we will publish all the papers from this conference, or at least most of them, I hope. Thank you very much.